Racist customer insults Muslim waiter, then learns he owns the diner. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the bustling streets, and the faint hum of life filled the air as people came and went from their daily routines. On the corner of Maple Avenue stood a small but vibrant diner, its exterior painted in bold, welcoming colors. Above the door, a large sign proudly declared, "Welcome to the Muslim-owned diner." The lettering was neat, and the words stood out boldly against the backdrop of the blue storefront. The diner was a reflection of its owner, a man who believed in openness, kindness, and the beauty of bringing people together. Inside, the diner buzzed with activity. Plates clinked, voices blended into a pleasant murmur, and the smell of freshly cooked food wafted through the air. Hassan, a young man in his early 30s, moved through the crowd with practiced ease. His attire, a simple yet traditional tunic and a neatly wrapped turban, spoke of his cultural pride. His warm smile and calm demeanor made him a favorite among regulars. Hassan was not just a waiter, he was the heart of the place. "Here you go, Mrs. Carter," he said, placing a plate of steaming hot shawarma in front of an elderly woman seated by the window. She beamed up at him, her wrinkled hands clasping the edges of her napkin. "Thank you, Hassan. This smells divine as always." Hassan nodded politely. "Enjoy your meal. Let me know if you need anything else." He moved on, checking on other tables and greeting customers with a quiet charm that seemed to put everyone at ease. It was a busy afternoon, but Hassan worked effortlessly, balancing plates, taking orders, and exchanging pleasantries with the kind of efficiency that only came from years of experience. The bell above the entrance jingled, signaling the arrival of a new customer. Hassan looked up to see a man entering, a stranger. The man was in his late 50s, with graying hair, a weathered face, and a demeanor that exuded discomfort. His eyes scanned the room warily before settling on an empty booth near the back. His name was Jim, though nobody in the diner knew that yet. He walked with a stiffness that suggested he wasn't thrilled to be there. Hassan approached the table, his notepad in hand. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to our diner. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Jim barely glanced at him. "Just coffee," he muttered, his voice gruff. He sat back, his arms crossed defensively, his eyes darting around the room as though he were looking for a reason to leave. There was a tension about him that was hard to ignore. "Of course," Hassan replied smoothly, as if he hadn't noticed the man's curt tone. He turned and headed to the counter, preparing the coffee himself. As he worked, he could feel Jim's eyes on him. It wasn't the first time Hassan had dealt with customers like this. People who walked in with preconceptions and mistrust. He had learned long ago not to let it rattle him. When Hassan returned with the coffee, Jim was tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. He set the cup down gently, his movements deliberate and calm. "Here you go. Are you ready to order, or would you like a few more minutes to decide?" Jim picked up the menu, flipping through it with a frown. "I don't know. What's all this stuff? Don't you have anything normal? Like a burger or something?" Hassan smiled faintly, his patience unshaken. "We do have a burger, sir. It's a house special with a Middle Eastern twist, seasoned with traditional spices. I think you might enjoy it." Jim scoffed, setting the menu down with a thud. "Figures. Nothing here is normal." He leaned back in his seat, his expression sour. "Just give me whatever's closest to a regular burger and make it quick." "Right away," Hassan replied, maintaining his composure. He scribbled the order down and walked away, ignoring the murmurs that had started to ripple through the diner. Some of the regulars had noticed Jim's attitude, their eyes following Hassan as he moved back to the kitchen. "Some people just can't help themselves," muttered Mrs. Carter from her window seat. A young couple seated nearby nodded in agreement. Hassan worked quickly, preparing Jim's meal with care. Despite the man's hostility, he treated the order with the same attention to detail he gave every dish. He believed that kindness could sometimes speak louder than words, and if his food could convey that kindness, all the better. When Hassan brought the plate to Jim's table, the man barely looked at it. "About time," he grumbled, picking up the burger and inspecting it like he expected it to bite back. He took a cautious bite, chewing slowly before setting it down. "What's in this? Tastes strange." "It's seasoned with za'atar and sumac," Hassan explained. "Traditional spices that add a unique flavor." Jim wrinkled his nose. "Unique, huh? That's one way to put it." The tension in the room grew thicker. Other customers exchanged glances, some whispering among themselves. Hassan could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he refused to let it affect his demeanor. He knew that moments like this required patience and grace. As Jim continued to eat in silence, a small group of regulars approached Hassan near the counter. One of them, a middle-aged man named Tom, leaned in and spoke in a low voice. "You're handling that guy better than I could. He's got no right to talk to you like that." Hassan offered a small smile. "Thank you, Tom. But it's okay. Sometimes people just need time to adjust." Tom shook his head, his expression one of disbelief. "You're too nice, Hassan. I hope he realizes how lucky he is to be eating your food." Hassan chuckled softly. "Let's hope so." As the minutes passed, Jim's demeanor didn't improve. He finished his meal, pushed the plate aside, and flagged Hassan down with an impatient wave. "Check now," he barked. Hassan nodded, retrieving the bill and placing it gently on the table. "Thank you for dining with us, sir. I hope you enjoyed your meal." Jim snorted, pulling out his wallet. "Yes, sure," he muttered, tossing a few bills onto the table. As he stood to leave, he glanced around the diner one last time, his gaze lingering on the sign above the counter that read "Community and Kindness, our recipe for success." He scoffed, shaking his head as he walked out the door. The bell jingled and the tension in the room seemed to ease. Hassan exhaled quietly, gathering the empty plate and clearing the table. As he worked, he couldn't help but wonder about the man who had just left. What had brought him here? And why had he seemed so angry? But Hassan didn't dwell on it for long. He returned to his tasks, his focus on the customers who remained, the people who appreciated what the diner stood for. Little did he know, Jim's story with the diner was far from over. The next morning, the diner opened as usual, with the smell of fresh bread and spices filling the air. Regulars filtered in, greeting Hassan warmly as he worked behind the counter. Despite the previous day's encounter with Jim, Hassan remained as calm and composed as ever. For him, each day was a new opportunity to serve his community, one plate at a time. However, by mid-morning, the bell above the door jingled again and Jim stepped in. This time, his expression was even more sour, his movements brusque as he scanned the room for a seat. The regulars, recognizing him from the day before, exchanged wary glances but said nothing. Hassan, ever the professional, approached him with a welcoming smile. "Good morning, sir. Nice to see you again," Hassan greeted, his voice warm and polite. Jim didn't return the pleasantry. Instead, he grunted and sat in the same booth as before. "Coffee. Black," he muttered without looking up. Hassan nodded and quickly prepared the order. When he returned with the coffee, Jim was already flipping through the menu with the same disdainful expression he had worn the day before. "Anything catch your eye today?" Hassan asked, his tone light. "Yeah," Jim said, setting the menu down harshly. "Do you have anything normal? Or do I have to eat more of that weird stuff you call food?" A hush fell over the diner. Several customers turned their heads, their eyes darting between Jim and Hassan. One woman shook her head in disbelief, whispering to her companion, "How can someone be so rude?" Hassan's smile never wavered. "We have a variety of dishes on the menu, sir. If you'd like, I can recommend something less spiced." Jim rolled his eyes. "Whatever. Just give me pancakes or something. Can't mess that up, can you?" "Of course," Hassan replied, maintaining his composure. He walked back to the kitchen, ignoring the growing murmurs from the other customers. He had always believed in letting actions speak louder than words, and today would be no different. As Hassan prepared the pancakes, the memory of his early days in the diner crept into his mind. The place hadn't always been this vibrant or welcoming. When he first opened it, he had faced skepticism from the community. People weren't sure what to make of a Muslim-owned diner in a predominantly conservative neighborhood. But Hassan had worked tirelessly to prove that his food, and his heart, were for everyone. Over time, the diner became a hub for the community, a place where differences were set aside in favor of shared meals and stories. By the time Hassan returned to Jim's table with the pancakes, the diner had resumed its usual buzz. Jim eyed the plate suspiciously before cutting into the stack with his fork. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Hassan thought he might actually enjoy the meal, but then Jim set his fork down with a loud clink. "These pancakes are fine," Jim said, his tone begrudging. "But why is everything here so fancy? Can't you just make simple, normal food?" Hassan tilted his head slightly. "Our menu reflects the flavors and traditions of my heritage, sir. But we always aim to make everyone feel at home." "Heritage," Jim muttered, almost to himself. He shook his head and looked around the diner. "This place is so different. It's not what I'm used to." Hassan didn't miss the way Jim's words dripped with judgment. Still, he chose his response carefully. Sometimes trying something different can lead to pleasant surprises. Jim didn't reply. Instead, he finished his meal in silence, occasionally glancing at the other customers as though he were trying to make sense of the diner's atmosphere. Once he was done, he placed a few bills on the table and left without another word. The bell above the door jingled as it closed behind him, and the tension in the room dissipated once again. "Why do you even let him stay?" Tom asked as Hassan cleared the table. "The guy's got no respect for you or this place." Hassan shrugged, stacking the empty plate and cup. "Everyone deserves a chance, Tom. Maybe he just needs time to see things differently." Tom shook his head, unconvinced. "You're a better man than me, Hassan. I wouldn't have the patience." Hassan smiled faintly and returned to the counter, where he began preparing for the lunchtime rush. Despite Jim's behavior, Hassan couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. What had brought Jim back to the diner? And why did he seem so out of place, not just in the diner but in his own skin? The answer came sooner than expected. Later that afternoon, just as the lunch crowd was thinning out, Jim returned for the third time in 2 days. This time he wasn't alone. A younger man, perhaps in his early 20s, accompanied him, looking uncomfortable but determined. The resemblance between them was striking enough to suggest they were father and son. Hassan greeted them both as they entered. "Welcome back, sir," he said, his gaze flicking briefly to the younger man. "And welcome to you as well." The younger man managed a small smile. "Hi. Thanks." Jim, on the other hand, looked as gruff as ever. He marched to the same booth without a word, and his son followed hesitantly. Once they were seated, Hassan approached with his notepad. "Can I get you both something to drink?" he asked. "Just water," the younger man said quickly. "For both of us." Hassan nodded and returned with 2 glasses of water. As he set them down, he couldn't help but notice the tension between the 2 men. The younger man seemed nervous, while Jim looked as though he were bracing for an argument. "What can I get for you today?" Hassan asked, hoping to ease the atmosphere. The younger man glanced at the menu. "I'll have the lamb kebabs," he said, his tone polite. Jim snorted. "Figures." The younger man frowned but said nothing. Hassan took the order and turned to Jim, who waved a hand dismissively. "I'll just have the same thing. Not like I have much choice here." Hassan took the order without comment and headed to the kitchen. As he prepared the food, he wondered about the dynamic between the 2 men. There was clearly a story there, one that seemed to explain at least some of Jim's behavior. When Hassan returned with the food, the younger man thanked him warmly, while Jim simply muttered under his breath. As they began eating, Hassan noticed the younger man trying to engage Jim in conversation. "Dad, this is good," he said, gesturing to the kebabs. "You should try it." Jim grunted. "It's all right." The younger man sighed. "You know, you could at least try to enjoy yourself." Jim set his fork down and looked at his son sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" The younger man hesitated, glancing around the diner as though unsure whether to continue. Finally he lowered his voice. "It means you don't have to act like this all the time. Nobody's out to get you." Jim's face darkened. "You don't understand?" "Maybe because you never explain anything," the younger man shot back, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You just sit there, judging everyone like it's your job to decide who belongs and who doesn't." The tension at the table was palpable, and Hassan, who had been discreetly watching from the counter, considered stepping in. But he knew this wasn't his place, at least not yet. Jim pushed his plate away and stood abruptly. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight. The younger man hesitated, looking torn, but ultimately followed his father out the door. As the bell jingled behind them, Hassan felt a pang of sadness. Whatever was happening between them, it was clear that the diner had become an unlikely stage for their unspoken struggles. As Hassan cleared their table, he couldn't help but wonder, what had driven Jim to come back? And what role did his son play in all of this? Whatever the answers, Hassan sensed that their story was far from over. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the dinner rush began to trickle in. Families filled the booths, couples sat at the smaller tables, and the hum of conversation warmed the air. Hassan worked tirelessly, his movements seamless as he took orders, delivered food, and checked on the satisfaction of his guests. Despite the busy evening, his thoughts occasionally drifted back to Jim and the younger man, his son most likely. Their brief but tense exchange earlier lingered in Hassan's mind like the faint aroma of spices in the diner. It was unusual for Hassan to dwell on customers, especially difficult ones, but something about Jim's behavior gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man was wrestling with more than just prejudice. There was a weight in Jim's eyes, a burden that seemed to color everything he said and did. Hassan had seen that kind of heaviness before, in himself, in friends who had struggled, in people who carried the weight of unspoken pain. The bell above the door jingled once again, and Hassan's heart sank slightly as he saw Jim return, alone this time. His face was drawn, his posture rigid, and he looked around the room as if daring someone to challenge his presence. The regulars noticed him too, their conversations faltering momentarily before picking back up in hushed tones. It was clear that Jim's presence unsettled them, but Hassan greeted him with the same warmth he extended to everyone. "Good evening, sir," Hassan said as Jim sat in his usual booth. "Welcome back. Can I get you something to drink?" Jim didn't respond right away. He stared at the menu for a long moment before finally muttering, "Coffee? Black." Hassan nodded, retrieving the order without comment. When he returned, Jim was still staring at the menu, his brow furrowed. Hassan placed the coffee in front of him and waited patiently for his order. "I'll have the lamb kebabs," Jim said finally, his voice lacking its usual gruffness. "Same as earlier." "Of course," Hassan replied. As he turned to leave, Jim stopped him. "Wait," he said, his tone uncertain. "Is that what your family eats?" Hassan paused, surprised by the question. "Yes, sir," he said, turning back to face Jim. "It's a popular dish in my culture. My family loves it." Jim nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the table. "Guess it's not bad." For a moment, Hassan thought he saw a flicker of something softer in Jim's expression. Regret, perhaps, or curiosity. It was hard to tell. But the moment passed quickly, and Jim returned to his usual silence. Hassan left him to his thoughts and headed back to the kitchen to prepare the meal. As he worked, Hassan couldn't help but reflect on Jim's question. It was the first time the man had shown even a shred of interest in something beyond his own grievances. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Hassan had learned long ago that even the smallest cracks in a person's defenses could let in the light. When Hassan returned with the kebabs, Jim thanked him quietly, a stark contrast to his earlier dismissiveness. He ate in silence, his shoulders hunched and his movements deliberate. Hassan watched from a distance, noting the way Jim seemed lost in thought. Whatever internal battle he was fighting, it was clear that he was far from finished. The evening wore on, and the diner began to empty out. As the last few customers trickled out the door, Jim remained in his booth, nursing his coffee. Hassan debated whether to approach him but ultimately decided to give him space. He busied himself with cleaning up, wiping down tables and stacking chairs. It wasn't until the diner was nearly empty that Jim finally spoke. "You've got a nice place here," he said, his voice breaking the quiet. Hassan turned to see Jim watching him, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," Hassan replied, setting down the rag he'd been using. "It's taken a lot of hard work, but I'm proud of it." Jim nodded, his gaze dropping to his coffee cup. "Must have been tough, starting something like this. People probably didn't make it easy." Hassan approached the booth slowly, sensing that this was a rare moment of vulnerability. "It wasn't always easy," he admitted. "But I've been fortunate to have the support of good people. And I believe in what this diner stands for." Jim looked up, his brow furrowing. "And what's that?" "Community," Hassan said simply. "Kindness. Bringing people together over good food. It's not about where you come from or what you believe, it's about sharing something meaningful." Jim snorted softly, but there was no malice in it. "Sounds idealistic." "Maybe," Hassan said with a small smile. "But I've seen it work. This place has brought people together who might never have crossed paths otherwise. It's more than just a diner, it's a home." Jim didn't respond right away. He stared into his coffee, his fingers tracing the rim of the cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "My son, he likes this place," he said. "Said it's different. Good different." Hassan's smile widened slightly. "I'm glad to hear that. He seems like a good man." Jim nodded again, his gaze distant. "He's better than me, that's for sure. Always telling me I need to let go of things. Move on." Hassan tilted his head, studying Jim carefully. "And do you think he's right?" Jim didn't answer right away. He seemed to be wrestling with the question, his jaw tightening as he grappled with whatever emotions lay beneath the surface. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "Maybe," he said. "But it's not that simple. There's a lot you don't know." Hassan nodded, respecting the man's boundaries. "Sometimes, letting go is the hardest thing to do," he said gently. "But it can also be the most freeing." Jim glanced at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you know about it?" "More than you might think," Hassan said. "But that's a story for another time." Jim studied him for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether to press further. In the end, he didn't. Instead, he pushed his coffee cup away and stood, pulling out his wallet. "Thanks for the food," he said gruffly, placing a few bills on the table. "You're welcome." Hassan replied. I hope to see you again. Jim didn't respond. He walked to the door and paused for a moment, his hand on the handle. For a brief second, it seemed like he might say something else, but then he pushed the door open and disappeared into the night. As the bell jingled behind him, Hassan felt a mixture of emotions: curiosity, hope, and a lingering sadness. Jim was a complicated man, that much was clear. But Hassan had learned long ago that even the most complicated people could surprise you. The next day, Hassan was back at the diner bright and early, preparing for another busy day. As he arranged the tables and set out fresh flowers, he couldn't help but wonder if Jim would return. Part of him hoped he would, though he wasn't entirely sure why. There was something about the man's struggle that struck a chord with Hassan, something that reminded him of his own journey. The bell above the door jingled, and Hassan looked up to see Jim's son standing in the doorway. He looked nervous, his hands stuffed into his pockets as he glanced around the room. Hassan smiled warmly and approached him. Good morning, he said. It's nice to see you again. What can I do for you? The young man hesitated before stepping further into the diner. I wanted to say thanks, he said, for how you've treated my dad. Hassan tilted his head slightly. Your dad's always welcome here, just like everyone else? The young man nodded, his expression earnest. I know he's difficult, but he's been through a lot. More than he lets on. Hassan gestured to a nearby booth. Would you like to sit and talk about it? The young man hesitated but eventually nodded. As they sat down, he began to share bits and pieces of his father's story, how Jim had lost his job, his home, and his sense of purpose all in the span of a few years. How he'd become bitter and angry, lashing out at the world around him. And how he struggled to find a way back. As Hassan listened, he felt a deep empathy for the man. He understood what it was like to feel lost, to carry the weight of pain and disappointment. And he realized that Jim's story was far from over. The morning air was crisp as Hassan finished setting up the diner for the day. The young man, Jim's son, who had introduced himself as Daniel, had left not long ago, but his words still lingered in Hassan's mind. There was a sadness in Daniel's voice when he spoke of his father, a quiet yearning to see the man he once knew instead of the bitter shadow he had become. It was a feeling Hassan understood deeply, and it only strengthened his resolve to extend kindness to Jim, no matter how difficult he might be. The bell above the door jingled, and Hassan looked up to see Jim entering the diner once again. His expression was guarded as usual, but there was something different about the way he carried himself. His shoulders, usually so stiff, seemed to droop slightly, as though he were weighed down by an invisible burden. He hesitated for a moment before making his way to his usual booth. Good morning, sir, Hassan greeted him with a smile. It's nice to see you again. Coffee to start? Jim nodded, not meeting Hassan's gaze. Yeah, black. Hassan brought the coffee over quickly, placing it gently on the table. Jim wrapped his hands around the cup, staring into the dark liquid as though searching for answers. Hassan decided to let him sit in silence, sensing that the man needed time to gather his thoughts. As the morning crowd began to filter in, Hassan moved through the diner, greeting customers and taking orders. But every so often, he glanced over at Jim, who remained in his booth, barely touching his coffee. Something was clearly weighing on him, but Hassan knew better than to push. It wasn't until the lunch rush had passed and the diner was quiet again that Jim finally spoke. Hassan had just finished clearing a nearby table when Jim's voice cut through the silence. Why do you do it? He asked, his tone low and gruff. Hassan turned to him, puzzled. Do what, sir? Put up with people like me, Jim said, still staring at his coffee. Why don't you just tell me to get lost like everyone else would? Hassan paused, considering the question. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Jim, folding his hands on the table. Because I believe people can change, he said simply. And sometimes all it takes is a little kindness to show them the way. Jim scoffed, shaking his head. Kindness doesn't fix everything. Some people are too far gone. I don't believe that, Hassan said, his voice calm but firm. I think everyone has the capacity to grow no matter how far they've fallen. It's just a matter of finding the right path. Jim looked up at him for the first time, his eyes hard but not unkind. And what makes you so sure of that? Hassan smiled faintly. Because I've seen it happen. In myself, in others. I've seen people overcome incredible challenges to become better versions of themselves. And I've seen how powerful it can be when someone chooses to believe in them. Jim didn't respond right away. He leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed over his chest. For a moment, it seemed like he was about to argue, but then he let out a heavy sigh. I used to believe that, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. A long time ago. Hassan tilted his head, sensing an opportunity to learn more about the man sitting across from him. "What happened?" he asked gently. Jim hesitated, his jaw tightening as he wrestled with the question. Finally he spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "Life happened. I worked hard, did everything I was supposed to do. But it wasn't enough. Lost my job, my house, my wife. Everything I worked for just gone." Hassan listened intently, his expression soft with understanding. "That must have been incredibly difficult," he said. "I can't imagine how hard it must have been to go through all of that." Jim shrugged, but there was no defiance in the gesture. "It is what it is. But it changes you, you know? Makes you see the world differently. Makes you bitter." "I understand that," Hassan said. "But bitterness doesn't have to define you. It's possible to let go of the pain and find something better." Jim shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Easier said than done." "Maybe," Hassan conceded. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Jim's words hanging in the air. Hassan could see the cracks in the man's armor, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. It was a small step, but it was progress. The bell above the door jingled again, and Daniel walked in, his eyes lighting up when he saw his father. "Hey Dad," he said, making his way to the booth. Jim's expression softened slightly, and he gestured for his son to sit. "What are you doing here?" "Just thought I'd join you for lunch," Daniel said, sliding into the booth. He nodded at Hassan. "Mind bringing me the usual?" "Of course," Hassan said with a smile. He returned to the counter to prepare Daniel's order, giving the two men some space to talk. As he worked, he couldn't help but listen to their conversation. Daniel was asking Jim about his day, trying to engage him in small talk. Jim's responses were short, but he seemed less defensive than usual. There was a hint of warmth in his voice, a sign that he was starting to let his guard down. When Hassan brought over Daniel's food, the younger man thanked him warmly and turned back to his father. "You know," he said, "this place has some of the best food I've ever had. You should really try the lamb stew next time." Jim chuckled softly, a rare sound that caught Hassan by surprise. "You're starting to sound like a commercial." "Just saying," Daniel said with a grin. "It's good stuff. And the guy who runs this place? He's the real deal." Jim glanced at Hassan, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I guess he is." Hassan smiled to himself as he returned to the counter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. Jim was starting to see the diner, and maybe even the world, in a new light. And for Hassan that was more than enough. The afternoon passed quickly, and as the sun began to set, Jim and Daniel prepared to leave. Jim hesitated at the door, glancing back at Hassan. "Thanks," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "You're always welcome here," Hassan replied. "Have a good evening, sir." As the bell jingled behind them, Hassan felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was a step in the right direction. And sometimes that was all it took to make a difference. The following day started like any other at the diner. Hassan arrived early, preparing the space with the same meticulous care he always did. He polished the tables until they gleamed, arranged the fresh flowers in vases, and made sure the spices and sauces were perfectly aligned on the counter. For Hassan, these small details weren't just about running a business. They were a way of showing pride in what he had built and respect for the people who walked through his doors. By mid-morning, the diner was bustling with activity. Regulars exchanged friendly banter, the kitchen buzzed with energy, and the aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air. Hassan moved effortlessly between tables, checking on customers and ensuring everything ran smoothly. It was a typical day, yet he couldn't help but wonder if Jim would return. His answer came sooner than expected. The bell above the door jingled, and Hassan looked up to see Jim entering the diner. This time he didn't come alone. Daniel was with him, and they were deep in conversation as they made their way to their usual booth. Hassan noticed a slight change in Jim's demeanor. He seemed less guarded, though the lines of worry still etched his face. Hassan approached their table with a warm smile. "Good morning, gentlemen. It's nice to see you both again. Coffee to start?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, please. And I'll have the lamb stew today." Hassan turned to Jim, who was scanning the menu with a thoughtful expression. After a moment he set it down and said, "I'll try the lamb stew too." Hassan nodded, his smile widening. "Excellent choice. I'll have it ready for you shortly." As Hassan prepared their meals, he thought about how much had changed in the past few days. Jim's visits had gone from tense and confrontational to something resembling curiosity, and now even openness. It was a slow transformation, but one that Hassan found deeply rewarding. When he brought the food to their table, Daniel thanked him enthusiastically, and even Jim offered a quiet thanks as he picked up his spoon. Hassan watched from a distance as they ate, noting the way Daniel talked animatedly while Jim listened with a faint smile. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes about the potential for healing and connection. After they finished their meal, Daniel excused himself to take a phone call outside, leaving Jim alone at the table. Hassan saw this as an opportunity to check in. "How was the stew?" he asked, approaching the table with a curious smile. Jim looked up at him, his expression neutral. "It was good," he admitted. "Surprisingly good." "I'm glad you enjoyed it," Hassan said. "It's one of my personal favorites. My grandmother taught me the recipe when I was a boy." Jim raised an eyebrow. "Your grandmother, huh? She must have been a good cook." "The best," Hassan said with a chuckle. "She believed food was a way of bringing people together, of showing love and care. I try to honor that in everything we make here." Jim nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window where Daniel stood talking on his phone. "Bringing people together," he murmured. "That's something I've never been good at." Hassan sat down across from him, sensing that Jim had more to say. "It's never too late to change that," he said gently. Jim let out a humorless laugh. "You sound like my son. Always telling me to let go and move on. Like it's that simple." "It's not simple," Hassan agreed. "But it's worth it. Holding on to pain and anger only keeps us stuck. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting, it means freeing ourselves to live fully again." Jim frowned, his jaw tightening. "What would you know about that?" Hassan paused, his gaze steady. "More than you might think," he said. "When I first opened this diner, not everyone was as welcoming as you might imagine. There were people who didn't want me here, who made it clear they thought I didn't belong. It hurt, but I had a choice to make. I could hold on to that pain and let it define me, or I could choose to focus on the people who supported me, the people who believed in what I was trying to build." Jim studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And that worked? You just let it go?" "It wasn't easy," Hassan admitted. "There were days when it felt impossible. But over time, I realized that holding on to anger was only hurting me. Letting go didn't mean those people were right. It just meant I wasn't letting them control my happiness." Jim didn't respond right away. He stared down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his empty bowl. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "I lost everything," he said. "My job, my house, my wife. It all fell apart. And when I tried to pick up the pieces, it felt like the world was against me. No one cared, no one wanted to help. So yeah, I'm angry. And maybe I don't know how to let that go." Hassan nodded, his expression compassionate. "I'm sorry for what you've been through, Jim. That kind of loss can feel unbearable. But you're not alone, and you don't have to carry that pain forever." Jim looked at him, his eyes searching. "You really believe that?" "I do," Hassan said firmly. "And I think your son believes it too. He cares about you, Jim. He wants to see you happy again." Jim glanced out the window at Daniel, who was still on the phone. A flicker of emotion crossed his face, regret, perhaps, or longing. "He's a good kid," Jim said quietly. "Better than I deserve." Hassan shook his head. "He doesn't see it that way. To him, you're his father, and that's enough. He wants to see you find peace, and I think you want that too." Jim didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. He sat back in his seat, letting out a heavy sigh. Before Hassan could say more, Daniel re-entered the diner, his phone call finished. He smiled as he approached the table. "Sorry about that. Work stuff." "No problem," Jim said, his tone lighter than before. He glanced at Hassan. "Thanks for the food. And for listening." "You're always welcome here," Hassan said, standing up. "Have a good day, Jim." As father and son left the diner, Hassan felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Jim's journey was far from over, but the walls he had built around himself were beginning to crack. And for Hassan, that was enough. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Hassan couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. Not just in Jim, but in the diner itself. Over the years, he had seen the diner become a place of connection and growth for so many people. And now it seemed it was doing the same for Jim. That evening, as Hassan closed up the diner, he reflected on the power of patience and kindness. It wasn't always easy, and it didn't always yield immediate results. But it had the potential to transform lives, to bridge divides, and to heal wounds that seemed beyond repair. As he locked the door and stepped out into the cool night air, Hassan smiled to himself. Tomorrow was a new day, and he was ready to face whatever it might bring. The next morning, Hassan arrived at the diner early as always. The quiet hours before opening were his favorite. They gave him time to reflect, to plan, and to prepare for whatever the day might bring. He brewed a pot of strong tea and sat at one of the corner booths, letting the aroma and warmth soothe his thoughts. The memories of his conversations with Jim lingered in his mind, and he found himself wondering if the man would return. When the bell above the door finally jingled later that morning, it wasn't Jim who walked in first, but Daniel. The younger man had a determined look on his face as he approached the counter. "Morning, Hassan," he said, his voice cheerful but tinged with urgency. "Is there a chance we could talk?" "Of course," Hassan replied, setting down the rag he'd been using to wipe the counter. "What's on your mind?" Daniel hesitated, glancing around the nearly empty diner before leaning in slightly. "It's about my dad," he said. "I think he's changing. Slowly, but it's there. And I think a lot of that has to do with you." Hassan raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Me?" "Yeah," Daniel said, nodding. "I don't know what you've said to him or how you've managed to get through, but I've seen a difference in him. He's not as angry all the time. He's even started talking about, moving forward." "That's wonderful to hear," Hassan said sincerely. "Your father is a good man, Daniel. He's just been carrying a lot for a long time." Daniel sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I know he's got a lot of baggage, but it's like he's finally realizing that he doesn't have to carry it alone. And I think coming here has helped him see that." Hassan smiled, feeling a warm sense of pride. "This diner has always been about more than just food. It's a place for people to connect, to heal. I'm glad it's been able to help your father in some way." Daniel nodded, his expression grateful. "Thanks, Hassan. Really. I just wanted to let you know that what you're doing here, it matters." Hassan placed a hand over his heart in a gesture of gratitude. "Thank you, Daniel. That means a lot to me." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the bell jingling again. Hassan turned to see Jim entering the diner, his expression softer than it had been in days past. He spotted Daniel at the counter and gave him a nod before making his way to their usual booth. "I'll leave you to it," Daniel said with a wink, heading over to join his father. Hassan watched as they settled into their seats, a sense of calm and familiarity between them that hadn't been there before. It was a small but significant change, and it filled Hassan with hope. The morning passed smoothly, with the diner bustling as usual. Hassan moved through the crowd, serving food, refilling coffee, and exchanging friendly words with the regulars. Every so often he glanced at Jim and Daniel, noting how their conversation seemed more fluid, less tense. It was clear that the walls between them were beginning to crumble. As the lunch rush ended and the diner quieted down, Jim approached the counter, his coffee cup in hand. He looked at Hassan with an expression that was hard to read, part gratitude, part unease. "Got a minute?" Jim asked, his voice low. "Of course," Hassan said, gesturing to one of the empty booths. "Let's sit." Jim followed him to the booth and sat down, cradling his coffee cup in both hands. For a moment he didn't say anything, his gaze fixed on the table. Hassan waited patiently, knowing that whatever Jim was about to say, it was important. "I owe you an apology," Jim said finally, his voice rough. "For how I treated you when I first came here." Hassan's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he remained quiet, letting Jim continue. "I judged you," Jim said, his grip tightening on the cup. "I walked in here and made all kinds of assumptions about you, about this place. And I was wrong." Hassan smiled gently. "Thank you for saying that, Jim. It means a lot." Jim shook his head, his expression pained. "No, it's not enough. I've been holding on to so much anger for so long, and I let it turn me into someone I'm not proud of. Coming here, seeing how you treat people, even people like me, it's made me realize how much I've let my pain control me." Hassan reached across the table, placing a hand on Jim's. "Letting go of pain is one of the hardest things we can do," he said. "But it's also one of the most important. You've taken the first step, Jim. That's something to be proud of." Jim looked at him, his eyes glassy with emotion. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you stay so patient? So kind?" Hassan's smile widened. "Because I've seen what kindness can do. It can build bridges, heal wounds, and bring people together. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it." Jim nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the table. "I don't know if I can ever be like that," he said quietly. "You don't have to be perfect," Hassan said. "You just have to try. Every day is a new chance to be better than the day before." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Jim's words hanging in the air. Finally, Jim let out a deep breath and looked up at Hassan. "Thank you," he said simply. Hassan nodded, his expression warm. "You're always welcome here, Jim. No matter what." Jim smiled faintly, the first genuine smile Hassan had seen from him. He stood and returned to his booth, where Daniel was waiting with a curious look. "What did you two talk about?" Daniel asked as Jim sat down. Just stuff, Jim replied, his tone lighter than it had been in a long time. Good stuff. Daniel grinned, clearly pleased. Well, whatever it was, it seems to be working. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully, but the atmosphere in the diner felt different. It was lighter, warmer, as though the invisible tension that had once lingered in the air had finally dissipated. Hassan watched as Jim and Daniel left together, their conversation easy and relaxed. It was a sight that filled him with a deep sense of satisfaction. As Hassan closed up the diner that evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought Jim to this point. It hadn't been easy and there were still challenges ahead, but the progress was undeniable. Jim had begun to let go of his anger, to reconnect with his son, and to see the world, and himself, through a kinder lens. For Hassan, it was a reminder of why he had started the diner in the first place. It wasn't just about serving food, it was about creating a space where people could come together, heal and grow. And in that moment, as he turned off the lights and locked the door, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to make a difference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new faces and new stories. But for now, Hassan was content, knowing that he had played a small part in helping someone find their way back to themselves.